Case 1. Ray Brent Marsh. In the dense, wooded marshlands of Noble, Georgia, a post-mortem predator utilized the high-walled privacy of a family-owned crematory to facilitate a decade-long campaign of systemic desecration. While grieving families throughout the tri-state area believed their loved ones had been reduced to sacred ashes, Ray Brent Marsh was methodically treating the deceased as industrial waste. He didn't rely on the master key of a stalker or the lure of a probation officer. He used the sacred trust of a multi-generational family business and a logistical lie to avoid the rising costs of propane. For over 10 years, the noble torch had been extinguished, leaving the woods behind the Marsh property to become a sprawling open-air tomb for over 300 human beings. Ray Brent Marsh was born in 1973 into a family that commanded immense respect in the small community of Noble. His father, Ray Marsh, had founded the Tri-State Crematory in the 1970s, establishing a professional credential that made the family name synonymous with dignity and care. By 1996, the younger Marsh had taken over the daily operations, a position that allowed him to move through the funeral industry with unchallenged authority. However, behind the director's mask was a man who had stopped operating the cremation retorts entirely. To the funeral homes that contracted his services, he was a reliable professional. To the families who received urns filled with powdered cement and dirt, he was a guardian of their most precious memories. The victims Marsh targeted were not specific individuals, but an entire population of the silent departed. Men and women like 71-year-old Charles Lyon, whose family was on the mend after his passing, seeking closure through his final wishes. In the early 2000s, families across Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama were unaware that their loved ones never reached the furnace. They were not supposed to encounter a crematory operator who would simply stack their bodies in sheds, burial vaults, and shallow pits. The violation was a calculated administrative erasure, with Marsh continuing to charge for services he never intended to perform. Because the property was private and the director was a trusted community figure. The forensic invisibility of the decay lasted for years. What Marsh did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by mass necrotic neglect. He didn't just stop working, he utilized a technical advantage by being located in a state that, at the time, did not require state inspections for crematories that didn't serve the public directly. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the cement substitution. To keep the paper trail moving, Marsh provided families with urns filled with a mixture of wood ash and dry concrete mix. He referred to the backlog of bodies as a technical problem with the furnace, believing that by allowing the natural environment to reclaim the remains, he had successfully bypassed the financial burden of operating his professional equipment. The pattern was finally broken in February 2002 through an environmental revelation triggered by an anonymous tip to the EPA. When investigators entered the property, they found a technical failure of the most horrific proportions. Human remains were discovered in every stage of decomposition, scattered across the 16-acre lot and piled inside rusting outbuildings. The institutional failure of Georgia's funeral laws was exposed when it was realized that Marsh had been operating without a valid license for years, yet no agency had ever verified his credentials or his output. Ray Brent Marsh pleaded guilty in 2004 to 787 felony counts, including theft by deception, abusing a corpse, and burial of body parts. During the proceedings, which became a national media sensation, prosecutors described the scene as a landscape of nightmares. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who realized the ashes they had cherished for years were nothing more than construction debris. On November 19, 2004, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison, followed by 75 years of probation. Throughout the sentencing, Marsh offered a brief, cryptic apology, stating, "I can't give you the answers you're looking for." The Marsh case fundamentally changed the landscape of the American funeral industry. It led to the Crematory Oversight Act, which mandated that all crematories, regardless of who they serve, must be licensed and subject to regular, unannounced state inspections. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative void in death care, prompting states across the country to close the noble loophole and verify the authenticity of cremains through chemical analysis. Ray Brent Marsh didn't have the law degree of Stephen McDaniel. He had a family reputation and a broken furnace. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who stand between us and our final rest. The irony of his capture was that the very privacy he used to hide the bodies was exactly what drew the attention of neighbors who noticed the shifting patterns of the earth and the local wildlife. He was released from prison in 2016, a man who spent a decade ignoring the dead and will spend the rest of his life as a pariah in the very system that once revered his name. Case 2. Megan Hess. In the small mountain community of Montrose, Colorado, a post-mortem predator utilized her dual role as a funeral director and a donor services founder to orchestrate a sophisticated black market trade in human remains. While grieving families believed they were receiving the cremated ashes of their loved ones, Megan Hess was methodically dissecting the deceased to fulfill orders for heads, torsos, and limbs from medical research firms. She didn't rely on the broken furnace of Ray Brent Marsh. She used the sacred trust of the Sunset Mesa funeral home and a technical loophole in federal body part regulations. For nearly a decade, she operated a body brokerage in the same building where she held memorial services, turning a house of mourning into an industrial slaughterhouse for profit. Megan Hess was born in 1977 and was raised with a focus on the family funeral business, eventually taking over the operations along with her mother, Shirley Koch. By 2009, she had founded Sunset Mesa Funeral Foundation, a professional credential that allowed her to present herself as a compassionate advocate for medical donation. However, behind the director's mask was a woman who had realized that a single human body was worth far more in parts than as a standard $1,000 cremation. By 2011, Hess's foundation became a logistical front for an international shipping operation. To the families in Montrose, she was a pioneer in affordable green burials. To the tissue banks she supplied, she was a high-volume vendor of fresh, biological specimens. The victims Hess targeted were families like the relatives of Victor Van Vliet, a 65-year-old man whose family was on the mend, and specifically requested that his body not be used for donation due to his medical history. In the high-altitude quiet of western Colorado, families were unaware that Hess was ignoring their no-donation orders entirely. They were not supposed to encounter a funeral director who would forge consent forms and use a power saw to dismember their loved ones minutes after the viewing. The violation was a calculated anatomical erasure, with Hess frequently shipping bodies that had died from infectious diseases like hepatitis and HIV to unsuspecting medical schools, putting researchers at risk. What Hess did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by consumable disarticulation. She didn't just steal, she utilized a technical advantage by co-locating her funeral home and her body broker business in the same facility, allowing her to move remains between rooms without public oversight. The technical weapon in her arsenal was the dummy urn. To maintain the illusion of cremation, Hess provided families with urns filled with a mixture of different people's ashes, or, in some cases, industrial floor sweepings. She referred to her victims as inventory, believing that as long as the family walked away with a heavy jar, the forensic reality of the empty casket would never be discovered. The pattern was finally broken in 2018 through a journalistic breakthrough led by a Reuters investigative team. When reporters began tracking the paper trail of human heads being shipped from Montrose, they found a technical failure in Hess's documentation. The signatures on the donation forms did not match the handwriting of the grieving relatives. The institutional failure of the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies was exposed when it was revealed that they had received complaints about strange smells and suspicious activity at Sunset Mesa for years, but had never conducted a physical inspection of the back room. Megan Hess pleaded guilty in 2022 to mail fraud and conspiracy. During the proceedings, which horrified the global medical community, prosecutors described her as a ghoul who treated the dead like old car parts. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of over 200 victims who realized they had been mourning over jars of dry concrete. On January 3, 2023, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the law. Throughout the sentencing, she remained eerily calm, never offering an explanation for why she had betrayed the trust of her own neighbors. The Hess case became a landmark study in the unregulated body broker industry in the United States. It led to the passage of the Consensual Donation and Research Integrity Act, which aims to create a federal tracking system for human remains used in research. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative void in Colorado, the only state at the time that did not require funeral directors to be licensed, prompting a total overhaul of state funeral laws to prevent a body shop from ever operating under the guise of a chapel again. Megan Hess didn't have the law degree of Andrew Schmuel. She had a crematory license and a surgical saw. She is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who offer to help you during your weakest moment. The irony of her capture was that the very donation labels she used to bypass shipping security were exactly what allowed federal agents to trace the body parts back to her doorstep. She remains in the Federal Medical Center, Carswell, a woman who tried to turn the sacred trust into a commodity and ended her life as a pariah in the very town that once trusted her with its dead. Case 3. David Sconce. In the sun-drenched suburbs of Pasadena, California, during the mid-1980s and tight industrial ghoul utilized the multi-generational prestige of a family funeral home to operate a post-mortem factory that treated human remains like scrap metal. While Southern California families believed they were honoring their loved ones with private, dignified cremations, David Sconce was methodically mass burning up to 18 bodies at a time in a single furnace. He didn't rely on the surgical saw of Megan Hess. He used the sacred trust of the Lamb Funeral Home and a technical advantage in high-heat logistics. For years, he acted as a pillar of the Pasadena business community, but beneath the somber suit was a man who saw the deceased as a source of secondary revenue. Harvesting everything from gold teeth to heart valves for the black market. David Sconce was born in 1954 and was raised as the heir apparent to a mortuary empire founded by his grandparents. By 1982, he had taken control of the Lamb Funeral Home and established Coastal Cremations, a professional credential that allowed him to undercut competitors' prices by promising efficiency. However, behind the director's mask was a man who had calculated that private cremations were a logistical waste of fuel and time. By 1985, Sconce's operation became a processing plant where bodies were stacked like cordwood. To the local parishes, he was a generous donor. To the biotissue companies he supplied, he was a high-volume provider of unregulated human organs. The victims Sconce targeted were families like the relatives of Karen Wiseman, a 34-year-old mother who was on the mend and rebuilding her life before a tragic accident took her. In the quiet neighborhoods of Altadena and Pasadena, families were unaware that Sconce was treating their loved ones' remains as commissary goods. They were not supposed to encounter a mortician who would use pliers and a hammer to pull gold crowns from the mouths of the deceased before shoving them into a crowded retort. The violation was a calculated forensic erasure, with Sconce handing back urns containing a random scoop of ash that might contain the remains of 10 different people, including pets he had cremated in the same batch. What Sconce did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by pyre overcrowding. He didn't just commingle, he utilized a technical advantage by modifying his furnaces to run at extreme temperatures for 24 hours a day, bypassing the cooling cycles required for safety and dignity. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the dental harvest. Sconce hired technicians specifically to extract gold and jewelry from bodies, once bragging that he made over $6,000 a month just from the teeth of the dead. He referred to the process as cleaning the inventory, believing that because the evidence was reduced to ash, the forensic reality of his mass cremations would be impossible to prove. The pattern was finally broken in January 1987 through a technical failure that literally ignited the sky when a massive fire broke out at a warehouse in Hesperia. Firefighters discovered it was an illegal, unlicensed crematory operated by Sconce. Inside, they found a logistical nightmare of hundreds of bodies piled on the floor and a furnace that had melted under the strain of overpacking. The institutional failure of the California Cemetery Board was exposed when it was revealed that Sconce had been operating multiple shadow crematories for years without a single permit, using his family's legitimate funeral home as a legal front. David Sconce was convicted in 1989 of over 20 counts of body mutilation and remains commingling. During the trial, which remains one of the most gruesome in California history, prosecutors described him as a man who stripped the dead of their last shred of humanity. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who had to learn that their loved ones had been treated as fuel for a furnace. On top of the desecration, Sconce was later implicated in the professional hit of a rival mortician who threatened to expose him. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the mortuary crimes, though his legal battles regarding the murder for hire lasted for another decade. The Sconce case fundamentally changed the landscape of mortuary law in the United States. It led to the Uniform Cremation Act, which mandated that only one human body can be cremated in a retort at a time and required strict chain of custody logs for all remains. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in the funeral industry, prompting states to implement gold recovery laws that make it a felony for a mortician to profit from the dental work of the deceased. David Sconce didn't have the crematory oversight of modern directors. He had a sledgehammer and a high-heat furnace. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who offer the most affordable path to closure. The irony of his capture was that the very high-volume efficiency he prized was what caused his illegal furnace to overheat and alert the world to his crimes. He remains a pariah of the industry, a man who tried to turn the sacred trust into a production line and ended his career as the man who broke the heart of an entire city. Case 4. Michael Mastromarino. In the sterile, high-stakes world of New York restorative dentistry, a medical predator utilized his professional license and a network of clandestine cutting rooms to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar body-snatching operation that desecrated over 1,000 graves. While grieving families believed their loved ones were resting in peace, Michael Mastromarino was methodically harvesting the dead to fulfill a global demand for human tissue and bone. He didn't rely on the high-heat furnaces of David Sconce. He used the professional shield of a doctor's degree and a technical advantage in surgical logistics. For years, he was a wealthy father and a successful surgeon at Biomedical Tissue Services. But beneath the white coat was a man who saw the deceased as raw material, a commodity to be stripped, forged, and sold to the highest bidder. Michael Mastromarino was born on September 4th, 1963, and was raised in the fog of high expectations and suburban achievement. He was a brilliant student who rose quickly through the ranks of New Jersey dentistry, eventually becoming a world-renowned expert in dental implants. However, behind the surgeon's mask was a man struggling with a debilitating drug addiction and a spiraling need for capital after his dental license was suspended for narcotics abuse. By 2002, Mastromarino had reinvented himself as a tissue recovery specialist, a professional credential that allowed him to move through the funeral industry with unchallenged authority. To his neighbors in Fort Lee, he was a success story. To the funeral directors he bribed, he was the silent partner who turned their morgues into profit centers. The victims Mastromarino targeted were not just the dead, but the families they left behind. People like the relatives of Alistair Cooke, the legendary 95-year-old broadcaster who was on the mend in the public memory after a lifetime of service. In 2004, Cooke's family was unaware that his remains had been intercepted by a cutting team before his cremation. They were not supposed to encounter a surgeon who would use reciprocating saws to remove the bones from a man who died of metastatic cancer, a condition that made his tissue lethally unfit for transplant. The violation was a calculated forensic erasure, with Mastromarino replacing the stolen leg bones with PVC plumbing pipes so the bodies would still look normal in an open casket. What Mastromarino did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by surgical forgery. He didn't just steal, he utilized a technical advantage by forging thousands of medical records, changing ages, causes of death, and consent forms to make diseased tissue appear clean for surgery. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the hardware store replacement. By sewing plastic pipes and cotton batting back into the corpses, he bypassed the physical inspections of funeral directors and families alike. He referred to the bodies as units, believing that because the evidence was buried or cremated, the technical failure of his forged paperwork would never be traced back to the thousands of unsuspecting patients who received his toxic bone grafts. The pattern was finally broken in 2005 through an administrative revelation triggered by a routine inspection of a Brooklyn funeral home. When investigators realized the names on the death certificates didn't match the logs at the crematory, they uncovered a logistical nightmare of a secret room filled with surgical tools and blood-stained floors. The institutional failure of the FDA was exposed when it was realized that Mastromarino had been shipping unvetted, cancer-ridden bone and heart valves to hospitals across North America for years without a single site inspection of his recovery facilities. Michael Mastromarino pleaded guilty in 2008 to hundreds of counts of body stealing, grand larceny, and forging documents. During the trial, which remains the largest body-snatching scandal in U.S. history, prosecutors described him as the architect of a house of horrors. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of transplant recipients who now lived in fear of contracting HIV or hepatitis from his stolen grafts. On June 27, 2008, he was sentenced to 25 to 58 years in prison. Throughout the sentencing, Mastromarino remained clinically detached, a man who had long ago ceased to see the humanity in his patients. The Mastromarino case fundamentally changed the landscape of the human tissue industry. It led to the Alistair Cook Protocols, which mandated stricter independent verification of consent forms and a closed-loop tracking system for all human tissue used in transplants. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in the gift of life industry, prompting the FDA to implement unannounced inspections of tissue banks and criminal background checks for all recovery personnel. Michael Mastromarino didn't have the broken furnace of Ray Brent Marsh. He had a surgical kit and a forged consent form. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who hide behind the highest professional credentials. The irony of his capture was that the very surgical precision he prized was what left behind the distinct industrial tool marks on the bone that eventually proved his guilt. He died in prison of bone cancer in 2013, a final system correction for a man who spent his life profiting from the very disease that ultimately claimed him. Case 5. John and Carrie Halford, in the rugged, high-altitude terrain of Penrose, Colorado, a domestic partnership of predators utilized the burgeoning green burial movement to mask a horrific scene of mass necrotic neglect. While environmentally conscious families believed their loved ones were being returned to the earth in biodegradable shrouds, John and Carrie Halford were methodically warehousing the dead in a dilapidated building without refrigeration. They didn't rely on the surgical prowess of Michael Mastromarino. They used the sacred trust of the Return to Nature funeral home and a technical advantage in unregulated state oversight. For years, they presented themselves as earthy, compassionate caregivers. But beneath the eco-friendly branding was a couple who saw the deceased as backlogged inventory, leaving 190 human beings to decompose in a house of horrors, while they spent the funeral money on luxury vehicles and laser treatments. John and Carrie Halford were born in the late 1970s and early 80s, entering the underworld funeral industry with a focus on alternative death care. By 2017, they had established Return to Nature, a professional credential that allowed them to move through the Colorado Springs community as pioneers of the natural death movement. However, behind the director's mask was a couple struggling with profound financial mismanagement and a spiraling debt load. By 2020, the Halfords' operation became a logistical black hole, where bodies were simply stacked on the floor of a 2,500 square foot facility. To their clients, they were soulful providers. To the neighbors who complained of a dead fish smell, they were a growing public health menace. The victims the Halfords targeted were families like the relatives of Carl Gross, a 78-year-old retired truck driver who was on the mend in his final years, finding peace in the idea of a simple, natural return to the soil. In 2023, his family was unaware that his remains had been tossed into a pile with nearly 200 others. They were not supposed to encounter a husband and wife team who would use dry concrete mix to fill urns, handing back fake ashes to families who had specifically paid for a green burial, a process that involves no cremation at all. The violation was a calculated administrative erasure, with the Halfords forging death certificates and transportation logs to make it appear that the bodies had been legally processed months prior. What the Halfords did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by atmospheric desecration. They didn't just fail to bury, they utilized a technical advantage by exploiting Colorado's status as the only state in the U.S. that did not require funeral directors to be licensed or even graduate from high school. The technical weapon in the Halfords' arsenal was the eco-friendly shield. By claiming that the natural smells were part of the green burial process or a result of clogged drains, they bypassed the initial concerns of local health inspectors. They referred to the bodies as cases, believing that as long as the building stayed locked and the fake ashes were delivered, the forensic reality of the liquefying remains would remain hidden behind the Penrose walls. The pattern was finally broken in October 2023 through an olfactory revelation that became impossible for the community to ignore. When local sheriff's deputies finally breached the building, they found a logistical nightmare that traumatized veteran investigators. Nearly 200 bodies piled in various states of advanced decomposition, many of them unrecognizable. The institutional failure of the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies was exposed when it was realized that Return to Nature had been operating with an expired license for almost a year, yet no official had ever stepped foot inside the facility to verify the welfare of the deceased. John and Carrie Halford were arrested in Oklahoma after a multi-state manhunt and charged with over 200 counts of abuse of a corpse, money laundering, and forgery. During the 2024 and 2025 proceedings, which gripped the nation, prosecutors described a calculated scheme of greed, where the couple used $130,000 in COVID-19 relief funds for personal vacations and a $90,000 GMC Yukon, while bodies rotted in their care. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who realized the cremains they had scattered in the mountains were nothing more than construction dust. In 2026, the legal process continues to bring the full weight of the system failure to light. The Halford case fundamentally changed the landscape of death care regulation in North America. It led to the Return to Nature Act, a sweeping reform that finally mandated licensure, background checks, and annual inspections for all funeral homes in Colorado. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in the natural burial industry, prompting a national conversation about the lack of oversight in green services and the need for a unified federal standard for the handling of human remains. John and Carrie Halford didn't have the surgical precision of Michael Mastromarino. They had a leased building and a bag of Quikrete. They are a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who wrap their crimes in the language of nature and peace. The irony of their capture was that the very open-air environment they claimed was part of their mission was exactly what allowed the forensic scent of their neglect to reach the nostrils of the law. They remain in the El Paso County Jail, a couple who tried to greenwash a massacre of dignity and ended their careers as a permanent stain on the industry they once claimed to revolutionize. Case 6, Robert Stevens. In the quiet, working-class neighborhoods of Philadelphia during the early 1990s, a post-mortem predator utilized the somber privacy of his family-run mortuary to operate a systematic theft ring that stripped the deceased of their final dignity. While grieving families believed their loved ones were being prepared for a peaceful rest, Robert Stevens was methodically harvesting the dead for precious metals and heirlooms. He didn't rely on the mass neglect of the Halfords. He used the sacred trust of the Stevens funeral home and a technical advantage in the privacy of the embalming room. For years, he was a respected figure in the North Philadelphia community, but beneath the funeral director's charcoal suit was a man who saw the dead as secondary revenue, a final opportunity to extract profit from those who could no longer speak. Robert Stevens was born in the mid-1950s and was raised in the fog of a family legacy that spanned generations in the death care industry. By the late 1980s, he had taken control of the family business, a professional credential that allowed him to move through the community with the absolute authority of a man of God. However, behind the director's mask was a man struggling with an insatiable greed that surpassed his professional ethics. By 1991, Stevens' operation became a metals recovery site, where bodies were routinely pilfered before the casket was closed. To the local church congregations, he was a pillar of support. To the pawn shops he frequented, he was a supplier of high-end vintage jewelry and dental gold. The victims Stevens targeted were families like the relatives of Annie Mae Jackson, an 82-year-old grandmother who was on the mend in the hearts of her family, remembered for her love of traditional Sunday dinners. In 1992, her family was unaware that her wedding band and gold necklaces had been forcibly removed behind the closed doors of the prep room. They were not supposed to encounter a funeral director who would use pliers and bolt cutters to snap rings from the fingers of the deceased. The violation was a calculated domestic erasure, with Stevens counting on the fact that families would rarely ask to inspect the body a second time once the final viewing was over. What Stevens did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by anatomical desecration. He didn't just steal, he utilized a technical advantage by being the sole person with access to the bodies during the witnessed embalming process. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the dental extraction. Stevens became notorious for prying gold crowns and bridges from the mouths of the dead, a process that left the victims' faces bruised and distorted, which he then masked with heavy layers of mortuary cosmetics. He referred to the stolen items as abandoned property, believing that because the deceased were bound for the earth, the forensic reality of their missing gold would remain buried forever. The pattern was finally broken in 1993 through a social revelation triggered by a suspicious family member who noticed a technical irregularity in their loved ones. Appearance during a final viewing. When police began investigating, they uncovered a logistical nightmare of hundreds of pawn tickets in Stevens' name, linked to jewelry that matched the descriptions of items buried with his clients. The institutional failure of the Pennsylvania Board of Funeral Directors was exposed when it was realized that Stevens had been operating with a pattern of minor complaints for years, none of which had ever triggered a physical audit of his inventory or his prep room. Robert Stevens was convicted in 1994 of multiple counts of theft, abuse of a corpse, and receiving stolen property. During the trial, which horrified the city of Philadelphia, prosecutors described him as a ghoul who fed on the memories of the dead. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who had to endure the second trauma of learning their loved ones had been robbed in their coffins. On October 11th, 1994, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Throughout the sentencing, Stevens remained unrepentant, a man who had spent his career hiding behind the cross while robbing the hands that held it. The Stevens case fundamentally changed the landscape of mortuary ethics in Pennsylvania. It led to the Funeral Home Transparency Act, which mandated that all jewelry and personal effects must be logged in a triple-signed document by the director and the next of kin before and after the service. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in small family funeral homes, prompting the state to implement mandatory prep room audits to ensure that the privacy of the embalming process is never used as a shield for criminal activity. Robert Stevens didn't have the surgical saw of Michael Mastromarino. He had a pair of pliers and a pawn slip. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who offer a helping hand, while simultaneously sliding the rings off your fingers. The irony of his capture was that the very community trust he relied on was what eventually brought him down, as the neighbors who once respected him were the ones who finally noticed the forensic artifacts of his greed. He served his time and faded into the fog of a disgraced legacy, a final system correction for a man who tried to turn the grave into a gold mine. Case 7. Jeanette Lyon. She operated funeral homes and cemeteries across Texas and the South for over a decade. And during that time, she desecrated the final resting places of an untold number of people. Though investigators believe the number of displaced remains reached into the hundreds. What made Jeanette Lyon different from other funeral directors was not just the financial fraud, but the physical audacity of her methods. Lyon did not rely on simple accounting tricks. She recycled occupied graves, stacked multiple bodies in single plots, dumped human remains in trash bins, and in several cases, sold the same cemetery plot to 3 different families. She was calculated, cold, and utterly indifferent to the sanctity of the sacred trust she was sworn to protect. Her staff whispered about the shifting headstones and the lost burial logs, jokingly calling her the grave shuffler. Lyon simply looked at the bottom line. Jeanette Lyon was born in the mid-1960s and was raised in a family that viewed the funeral industry as a lucrative real estate venture rather than a ministry. By the late 1990s, she had acquired a string of properties, including the Memory Garden Cemetery, a professional credential that allowed her to move through the Texas bereavement community as a successful entrepreneur. However, behind the director's mask was a woman who had realized that empty cemetery space was her most valuable asset, even if it wasn't actually empty. By 2002, Lyon's operation became a logistical shell game where old graves were cleared to make room for new, higher-paying clients. To the local, townspeople, she was a business leader. To the groundskeepers, she ordered to dig deep and ignore what you find. She was a woman who saw the dead as obstacles to a sale. Lyon's victims were families like the relatives of Samuel Rodriguez, a 62-year-old veteran who was on the mend in the memory of his community, honored for his decades of service. In 2004, his family was unaware that his private plot had been resold, and his remains moved to an unmarked communal pit to make room for a more expensive monument. They were not supposed to encounter a cemetery owner who would use a backhoe to crush existing caskets to create vertical space for new arrivals. The violation was a calculated domestic erasure, with Lyon counting on the fact that once the grass grew over a grave, no one would ever verify who or how many were actually resting beneath the headstone. What Lyon did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by grave recycling. She didn't just double-sell plots. She utilized a technical advantage by intentionally losing or destroying historical burial maps, creating an administrative fog that made it impossible for families to prove where their ancestors were located. The technical weapon in her arsenal was the communal burial. When space ran low, Lyon ordered bodies to be stacked 3 deep in single-capacity vaults, charging 3 separate families for a private experience. She referred to the displaced remains as debris, believing that because the families were focused on their grief, the forensic reality of the recycled soil would never be exposed. The pattern was finally broken in 2005 through an institutional revelation triggered by a whistleblower groundskeeper who could no longer stomach the shuffling. When state investigators conducted a ground-penetrating radar sweep of her properties, they uncovered a logistical nightmare of hundreds of sets of remains that did not match the cemetery's official records. The institutional failure of the Texas Funeral Service Commission was exposed when it was realized that Lyon had been renting headstones for funerals, placing a stone for the service and removing it days later to hide the fact that the body had been buried in an illegal, unmarked area. Jeanette Lyon was convicted in 2006 of multiple counts of securing execution of a document by deception, abuse of a corpse, and felony theft. During the trial, which outraged families across the South, prosecutors described her as a real estate swindler who specialized in the dead. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who had to watch as their loved ones' graves were excavated, only to find empty caskets or commingled remains. On September 21st, 2006, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence many felt was far too light for the spiritual murder she had committed. Throughout the sentencing, Lyon remained stoic, never offering an apology for the grave shuffling that had destroyed a century of community history. The Lyon case fundamentally changed the landscape of cemetery oversight in the United States. It led to the Perpetual Care Act, which mandated that all cemeteries maintain digitized, off-site burial maps and subject their grounds to annual physical audits by state inspectors. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in privately owned cemeteries, prompting states to implement vesting laws that make the unauthorized movement of a human body a high-level felony, regardless of the property's ownership. Jeanette Lyon didn't have the surgical saw of Michael Mastromarino. She had a backhoe and a stolen map. She is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who treat the final rest as a temporary lease. The irony of her capture was that the very space-saving techniques she used were what caused the ground to settle unevenly, alerting the world to the forensic artifacts of her greed. She served her time and disappeared into the fog of a disgraced legacy, a final system correction for a woman who tried to sell the same piece of heaven to 3 different people. Case 8. Wayne Remmer. He operated a network of funeral homes across the Florida Panhandle for over 15 years. And during that time, he provided grieving families with hundreds of urns containing what he claimed were the cremated remains of their loved ones. Though investigators eventually discovered that many of those urns contained nothing but pulverized concrete and wood ash. What made Wayne Remmer different from other funeral directors was the sheer scale of his administrative deception. Remmer did not rely on a single oversight or a temporary equipment failure. He collected thousands of dollars for cremations he never performed, issued fraudulent certificates of disposition, and utilized a series of shadow properties to store the deceased in conditions that defied every professional standard. His staff joked about the eternal backlog in the storage bays, quietly referring to him as the ghost maker. Remmer ignored the whispers, focusing instead on the rapid expansion of his funeral empire. Wayne Remmer was born in the late 1940s and was raised in a family that viewed the funeral industry as a cornerstone of community trust and steady financial returns. By the 1990s, he had established the Remmer Funeral Home, a professional credential that allowed him to move through the coastal communities of Florida as a compassionate and reliable caretaker. However, behind the director's mask was a man who had begun to prioritize profit margins over the basic tenets of his license. By 2000, Remmer's operation became a logistical shell game where the rising costs of fuel and maintenance were bypassed entirely. To the local civic groups, he was a dedicated member of the business elite. To the families who trusted him with their most vulnerable moments, he was a merchant of phantom ashes. Remmer's victims were families like the relatives of Alice Whitaker, a 74-year-old grandmother who was on the mend in the memory of her children, known for her lifelong commitment to local charities. In 2001, her family was unaware that her remains had been placed in an uncooled storage unit rather than the crematory they had paid for. They were not supposed to encounter a funeral director who would provide them with a decorative urn filled with construction-grade materials to simulate the weight of a human life. The violation was a calculated administrative erasure, with Remmer relying on the social shield of his long-standing reputation to prevent any family from ever questioning the contents of their loved one's final vessels. What Remmer did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by post-mortem substitution. He didn't just fail to cremate, he utilized a technical advantage by exploiting the high-volume nature of his regional contracts, which made it difficult for state inspectors to track individual chains of custody. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the paperwork loophole. By filing forged state documents that claimed cremations had occurred at distant third-party facilities, he created an administrative fog that satisfied the local health departments. He referred to the stored remains as unprocessed units, believing that because the families were seeking closure, the forensic reality of the abandoned remains would remain hidden behind the locked doors of his off-site garages. The pattern was finally broken in 2002 through an administrative revelation triggered by a routine audit of his business records. When state investigators followed the trail to one of his rented storage units, they uncovered a logistical nightmare that shocked the Florida Department of Funeral, Cemetery, and Consumer Services. Dozens of human remains discovered in various stages of neglect, some having been stored for over a year. The institutional failure of the state's inspection schedule was exposed when it was realized that Remmer had been operating with satisfactory ratings, despite the massive backlog of unfulfilled services. M. Wayne Remmer was convicted in 2003 of multiple counts of grand theft, fraud, and the improper preservation of human remains. During the trial, which led to a massive class action lawsuit from hundreds of Florida families, prosecutors described him as a fraudster who specialized in the finality of death. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who had to learn that the ashes they had buried or scattered were nothing more than industrial waste. On July 15, 2003, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence meant to reflect the hundreds of individual betrayals he had orchestrated. Throughout the sentencing, Remmer remained largely silent, a sharp contrast to the consoling professional he had portrayed for decades. The Remmer case fundamentally changed the landscape of death care accountability in the Southeast. It led to the Cremation Verification Act, which mandated that all crematories must use metal identification tags that survive the cremation process and remain with the ashes at all times. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in multi-facility funeral operations, prompting states to implement random inventory counts to ensure that the number of remains on site matches the number of active contracts. M. Wayne Remmer didn't have the surgical saw of Michael Mastromarino. He had a storage key and a bag of cement. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who provide a convenient answer to a difficult situation. The irony of his capture was that the very phantom ashes he used to satisfy his clients were what eventually provided the chemical evidence that led to his conviction. He served his time and faded into the fog of a disgraced legacy, a final system correction for a man who tried to turn the sacred trust into a game of empty containers. Case 9, Lawrence Larry DeLoya. He operated as a licensed funeral director and embalmer in the Newark, New Jersey area for over 20 years. And during that time, he provided contract services to dozens of smaller funeral homes that lacked their own preparation facilities. Though investigators eventually discovered that he was processing human remains in an unlicensed, unsanitary storage unit that lacked even the most basic medical infrastructure. What made Larry DeLoya different from other funeral industry predators was the absolute abandonment of clinical standards in favor of a back-alley logistics model. DeLoya did not rely on a prestigious chapel or a high-end fleet of vehicles. He utilized a rented garage with no running water or ventilation to perform complex embalming procedures, often leaving the deceased in a state of profound neglect while he moved between jobs. His peers in the industry whispered about the strange chemicals he used and the speed of his turnaround, jokingly calling him the midnight embalmer. DeLoya simply focused on the high-volume cash payments from funeral homes looking to cut costs. Larry DeLoya was born in the early 1960s and was raised in a region where the funeral business was a tightly knit network of family-owned storefronts. By the late 1990s, he had established himself as a freelance specialist, a professional credential that allowed him to move through the New Jersey death care community as an indispensable, if eccentric, technician. However, behind the director's mask was a man who had completely bypassed the sacred trust of the embalming room. By 2005, DeLoya's operation became a logistical shadow, where the safety of the public and the dignity of the dead were secondary to his mobile business model. To the funeral directors who hired him, he was a fixer who handled the difficult cases. To the public health officials who finally breached his lab, he was a biological hazard in a business suit. DeLoya's victims were families like the relatives of Robert Santangelo, a 68-year-old retired factory worker who was on the mend in the hearts of his grandchildren, remembered for his love of the Jersey Shore. In 2006, his family was unaware that his final preparation was being conducted in a cluttered storage locker next to stacks of old tires and household junk. They were not supposed to encounter a licensed professional who would use industrial-grade chemicals and garden hoses to simulate a medical-grade embalming process. The violation was a calculated administrative erasure, with DeLoya relying on the professional shield of his license to ensure that no one ever checked the physical location of his prep room. What DeLoya did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by substandard processing. He didn't just operate without a permit. He utilized a technical advantage by acting as a middleman, ensuring that the families never actually met him or saw where their loved ones were taken. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the mobile prep kit. By carrying his tools in a nondescript van and using unlicensed spaces, he bypassed the institutional failure of the state's inspection system, which only audited registered funeral homes, not private storage units. He referred to his workspaces as temporary sites, believing that because the bodies were eventually returned to a high-end casket for the viewing, the forensic reality of their back alley treatment would remain hidden behind the heavy layers of cosmetics. The pattern was finally broken in 2007 through an administrative revelation triggered by a landlord who noticed technical irregularities and a pervasive odor coming from a rented garage in Hillside, New Jersey. When health inspectors finally gained entry, they uncovered a logistical nightmare that horrified the community. Human remains being processed on folding tables in a space with no drainage, no refrigeration, and no biohazard disposal. The institutional failure of the New Jersey Board of Mortuary Science was exposed when it was realized that DeLoya had been subcontracting for established funeral homes for years without any agency verifying where the actual work was being performed. Larry DeLoya was stripped of his license and faced multiple criminal charges related to the improper handling of human remains and operating an unlicensed mortuary. During the proceedings, which forced several prominent New Jersey funeral homes to issue public apologies, prosecutors described him as a technician who traded dignity for a discount. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who realized their final goodbyes had been preceded by a back alley nightmare. In 2008, the legal system ensured he would never again touch the remains of the deceased. Throughout the process, DeLoya remained defensive, claiming he was providing a necessary service for an overcrowded industry. The Deloya case fundamentally changed the landscape of mortuary subcontracting in the Northeast. It led to the Prep Room Disclosure Act, which mandated that any funeral home using an off-site facility must disclose the address of that facility to the family and maintain a direct line of sight for state inspectors. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in the freelance mortuary market, prompting states to implement mobile technician permits that require GPS logging and physical facility verification for every licensed embalmer. Larry Deloya didn't have the surgical saw of Michael Mastromarino. He had a garage key and a garden hose. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who find a technical loophole in the system's oversight. The irony of his capture was that the very logistical freedom he sought was what eventually created the environmental signals that led to his downfall. He faded into the fog of a disgraced career, a final system correction for a man who tried to turn the sacred trust into a back alley transaction. Case 10. Manuel Menendez. He controlled some of the most historic and prestigious cemetery properties in southern Florida for over 30 years. And during that time, he promised thousands of families the dignity of a permanent, private resting place. Though investigators eventually discovered that he was recycling grave sites to maximize every square inch of available real estate. What made Manuel Menendez different from other funeral industry predators was the systematic, cold-blooded efficiency of his space management model. Menendez did not rely on a single rogue employee or a temporary lapse in record-keeping. He utilized heavy machinery to recompact occupied graves, crushing existing caskets to make room for new arrivals, and in dozens of cases, he stacked as many as 5 unrelated individuals into a single capacity vault. His groundskeepers whispered about the moving headstones and the vanishing markers, jokingly calling him the landlord of the dead. Menendez ignored the whispers, focusing instead on the high-value inventory of a sold-out cemetery. Manuel Menendez was born in the 1940s and built a business empire that viewed the funeral industry as a high-margin land management venture. By the 1990s, he had acquired Caballero Rivero Woodlawn, a professional credential that allowed him to move through the Miami and Dade County communities as the premier provider for the region's elite. However, behind the director's mask was a man who had realized that a full cemetery was a stagnant asset. By 2001, Menendez's operation became a logistical shell game, where the sacred trust of a deeded plot was treated as a temporary lease. To the local community, he was a guardian of Florida's history. To the families who unknowingly shared a grave with strangers, he was the architect of a post-mortem tenancy. The victims Menendez targeted were families like the relatives of Elena Rodriguez, a 70-year-old matriarch who was on the mend, in the hearts of her vast extended family, remembered for her resilience and faith. In 2002, her family was unaware that her private plot had been physically altered to accommodate multiple, unauthorized roommates beneath the surface. They were not supposed to encounter a director who would use backhoes and manual probes to check for empty pockets in occupied rows. The violation was a calculated administrative erasure, with Menendez relying on the social shield of his massive corporate influence to ensure that no one ever questioned why a headstone had shifted 3 feet to the left. What Menendez did followed a chilling technical pattern defined by vertical overcrowding. He didn't just double-sell plots. He utilized a technical advantage by exploiting the soft, sandy composition of the Florida soil, which allowed for the resetting of burial vaults without leaving obvious surface trauma. The technical weapon in his arsenal was the broken vault strategy. When a new burial was sold for a full section, Menendez's crew was ordered to punch through the lids of existing vaults, creating a commingled space that bypassed the physical limits of the cemetery map. He referred to the displaced remains as fill, believing that because the families were looking at the flowers on the surface, the forensic reality of the crushed caskets would remain buried beneath the limestone. The pattern was finally broken in 2002 through an institutional revelation triggered by a lawsuit from a family who noticed technical irregularities during a nearby excavation. When state investigators conducted a forensic dig at Woodlawn Park Cemetery, they uncovered a logistical nightmare that horrified the state of Florida. Human remains, casket handles, and nameplates from different decades were found tangled together in single plots. The institutional failure of the Florida Department of State was exposed when it was realized that Menendez had been erasing old burial records for years to create phantom inventory for new sales. Manuel Menendez faced a massive $100 million class action settlement and criminal probes related to the desecration of graves and consumer fraud. During the proceedings, which became the largest cemetery scandal in Florida history, prosecutors described him as a grave robber in a suit. The courtroom was filled with the heart-wrenching testimony of families who had to endure the second trauma of knowing their loved one's final rest had been physically violated for a real estate upgrade. In 2004, the settlement forced a total restructuring of the company's management. Throughout the process, Menendez maintained that the overcrowding was a result of clerical errors and historical mapping issues. The Menendez case fundamentally changed the landscape of cemetery real estate in the United States. It led to the Cemetery Consumer Protection Act, which mandated that all burial plots must be GPS tagged and verified by an independent surveyor before a deed can be transferred. It highlighted the dangers of the administrative fog in large cemetery chains, prompting states to implement probing bans that make it a felony to use mechanical tools to verify the contents of a deeded grave without a court order. Manuel Menendez didn't have the surgical saw of Michael Mastromarino. He had a backhoe and a forged deed. He is a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who treat the final rest as a negotiable contract. The irony of his capture was that the very space-saving techniques he used were what caused the ground to subside, creating the forensic artifacts of the broken vaults that eventually brought his empire down. He remains a warning to the industry, a final system correction for a man who tried to landlord the one place where everyone is supposed to be equal.